Hi, my name is Gary and I'm one of the elders at Lakeview Church, and I have the privilege of sharing today's devotion. Now, I'm reading in the book of Nehemiah, and just to remind you, Nehemiah was living in Persia, and he was one of the exiles from Israel. Recall that Babylon had carried away the nation of Judah and destroyed the temple, and the nation of Israel at that time spent 70 years in captivity. Later, Persian kings came and conquered the Babylonian Empire and allowed Jews to go back to Israel and to rebuild the temple. Now, Nehemiah wasn't one of the first people to go back to Judah to help rebuild the temple. He was actually an official in the king of Persia's court. And while he was serving there, one of his brothers came from Jerusalem and shared with him the sorry state of Jerusalem's walls. You see, the walls were torn down by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire and destroyed along with the temple. Now, walls were really important in Nehemiah's day because it protected you. It protected you from the people outside, from robbers, from enemies that wanted to come in and to attack you. And it protected you from being threatened by people around you. Well, Nehemiah found out that the city of Jerusalem's walls were torn down and that the city itself was in disarray. Well, God moved Nehemiah's heart to do something. Inspired by God and supported by God's provision, Nehemiah got permission from the king to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, and he went back. And the book of Nehemiah chronicles the story of how this wall was miraculously built by this man's leadership and by God's provision. And specifically today, I'd like to share with you about Nehemiah Chapter 12. In that chapter, we read about the dedication of this wall after it was rebuilt in 55 days. Yeah, so this big city, if you think about the size of it, several miles around, was broken down walls, and in 55 days it was built up stone supporting foundation that protected the city of Jerusalem. What really impressed me about this was what Nehemiah and his countrymen and women did after the wall was rebuilt. They celebrated, not surprisingly. They listened to the law of God read to them by Ezra and other Levites, and rededicated themselves to following God and honoring Him. And then they did something very interesting. What they did is Nehemiah called the Levites and priests from the surrounding area and from Jerusalem, and he brought them all together. And what they did is they got the musicians and the singers, and they went up on the wall, and they sang and walked around the wall and praising God. And I was really struck by that, how they engaged in worship. It seemed, as I read that passage and as I read other passages in the book of Nehemiah, that worship was a normal part of their daily lives. It was simply an outflow of the gratitude they had for what God had done for them. And I remember another scripture passage in Luke. You might remember when Jesus responded to a question about what the greatest commandment was. Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And as I thought about what does it mean to be loving God with all my heart, one of the things that came across was this idea of passionately engaging in worship. Singing, playing, listening to music, praying, proclaiming God's greatness, not just on Sunday, but every day. How was worship a part of, I just was impressed by how worship was a part of Nehemiah and his kinsmen, their lives. I wondered, how is worship a part of my everyday life? And so I ask you the same question that I ask myself. How is worship a part of your everyday life? Not just the life that you show up on Sunday and the songs that you sing, but your everyday, your mornings, your evenings, and your afternoons. Think about it. May God's blessing be with you, and may worship truly grow in your heart.